Yes? Okay. Okay, quick points in the model. First of all, we think that this is only going to apply in extreme cases of like really hard attack to the economy. We think that some sanctions to Russia are not going to go into this debate because international community are only going to consider like big attacks like what happened in Cuba, in Venezuela, or in Iran in the 80s. That means that you are really killing the economy of this country and therefore they have a right to respond to you. Second thing we say is that you have to have a single responsible of that. It's not like the international community as a whole is putting you into a block because you cannot like attack all the countries in the world. In that is like when one country or a couple of 3 countries are like surrendering you and putting you under this economic pressure. And thirdly, we think that this is really important, that it has to be proportional. We're not saying that you have the right to invade that country which is putting you under economic pressure, but perhaps doing some strikes with Air Force and putting like some gunfire in the border, but not attacking the country and killing thousands of people, because they will not be proportional, it will be against international law. Now, 3 things that we think that did not go into this debate. First thing, we think that when we are talking about a small country being pressed about for a big country, this is not going to go into this debate because the simple reason that a small country is not never going to provoke this kind of military tension with the big ones. It's only going to happen when like this a medium to medium size. Secondly, we think that also this is not going to happen when the country which are under economic pressure thinks that this is going to backlash really high against them and that the economic military forces of the other country are so big that they are going to be like destroyed. And thirdly, we think that also when the military escalation is very dangerous, for example, nuclear powers, this is also not going to happen because they are not going to take such a big risk. We think that the frame of this debate is for like those African countries, those Asian countries, which are medium or small size, which have economic tensions right now, and in some points are putting the other one in a really difficult situation. 2 points of opening government. First of all, clarification, yes?
Can you expand on proportionality? What does proportionality mean?
That's my first point. My first point is how this works through proportionality and legit defense. We think that what you are going to allow is to put on them the same level of violence that they are putting on you. What we think is that right now, the international law said that when you are met with violence, you can respond with violence. The point is that they miss the context of the past decades in which economic violence is even more important than military violence. That means that economic violence in places like Venezuela, Cuba, or Iran, when George Bush's father was in charge in the United States, had put these countries in huge trouble and has caused them high level of violence which they have to meet. We think that this is a legit defense to respond to this attack in a proportional way. If they are causing you like this harm, you can cause them the same harm but through a different mechanism, not using the economic violence but the military violence, because it's the only thing that you can respond. The point here is why we think that this economic violence is as big as the military violence, and therefore it is proportional, and there is a legit defense principle in which like the international law has to go forward in order to include this in the things that the countries can do in order to respond when they are attacking. First thing, we think that these countries are put in high starvation situations because they like the first thing that the other country is going to cut is the food, is the water, and they are going to put it in really bad situations. Secondly, we think that in the short term they damage really key points of the economy by cutting commercial roads, that not letting that commodities go into your economy, which are the only way that they are developing and the only way that they are putting people in jobs. That means that many people lose their jobs. But more importantly, we think that in the long term this leads to the development of these countries through decades of not being able to fight against this situation. And we think that like Venezuela, Cuba, but especially Iran is a very good example of this. During the 80s, when Iraq was the ally of George Bush's father, they put a high economic pressure into Iran, which was the enemy in that point, and for 10 years they put them in a great economic problems. Statistics and international studies say that almost 2,000 people die because of that, because starvation, because lack of medical equipment in the hospitals. And thirdly, they say that the average size of the population decreased in 5 centimeters because of the lack of alimentation, of the starvation of the population. We think that this kind of situation which opening government is talking about, it's like they are legit to use force as if they've been attacked. We see no difference, and they have to justify in opposition the difference in going in a strike with airplanes and killing kill 2,000 people. What's the difference between that and killing during 10 years 2,000 people through starvation directly? We think that's the same principle, and as the international law already recognizes that when you are attacked, you can respond, we think this is the same case. Second point in open government is how this will lead to more peaceful end of conflicts. First point is we think that obviously this is going to act as a mechanism of deterrence. Obviously, you are not going to put such a heavy economic pressure in order to kill people in the other country when you know that they can respond. Now, in the context that we explain of medium or small countries, if the small country want to react, no thank you, they are going to face the international community. If now, I don't know, Iran want to respond against Iraq, the international community and United Nations are going to say no, or they are going to use like their force in order to stop that attack. Therefore, they have no tool to stop that economic attack. Now that the economic attacker knows that they can be met with violence and that the international community is not going to respond and to protect them, they are going to think much more about that before putting this pressure and this first step of violence in the place. Closing.
Sanctions exist. In order to achieve more deterrence, you need to consider that this actually does in proportional harm to these countries, because they are harm more than the sanctions that they have done.
Point. I think I already explained why we are talking about really extreme cases in which it's not like just sanctions, but putting you under a block which do not let you develop your economy. If not, this is not going to be going into the model of open government. We say that only in extreme cases this is going to be allowed. Second mechanism in why will lead to more peaceful conflict, we say that when the violence starts, international community tends to intervene because it goes to the press, because Western citizens are really sensible about these topics, and therefore they will press the governments in order to put an end. It's not the same when they are in starvation and they are in economic block, because they cannot see the violence and they are not so sensitive to that. That means that probably international community will force into negotiation in these countries before it goes to an escalation of the conflict, and they will put an end to this. The comparative here is that we say that it's better to have 5 months of violence, like real violence in war. That's better than having 20 years or 10 years of economic starvation of a country and not putting an end of this conflict at all. We think that is proportional. We think that the violence will be decreased. We are proud to propose.
I thank that speaker very much and welcome the LO.
Yeah. Okay. Look, international law is a very fine thing, but unfortunately in many cases it's not relevant because the vital interest of one country is threatened. They do not really care about anything the international community can do against the country, because they tend to be minor sanctions, and even then it's very hard to do so because usually alliances exist. And for example, you can at least have one country that still will supply you also for kind of economic analysis. I think international law only matters in a very specific amount of cases, usually where very large in fact actors are involved, often alliances and often larger actors like the US that really do need the legitimacy, for example, to justify these kind of things towards their own democratic population or against the other countries that they're also in and are usually not very much a fan of doing wars, such as, for example, US and the European Union. Therefore, lots of the cases that opening up government wants to talk about, we have cases, for example, from stronger countries and weaker countries, where this weaker country is being harmed by the stronger country, or, for example, countries with relative strength are not really going to be really relevant in this debate. What we think is going to be mostly relevant in this debate are actors, for example, like China, currently using economic means to essentially control their region, now significantly more likely to lead to actual conflicts where the US will step in because it cannot do so because it has legitimate reason to defend the economic interests of another country, and therefore, as a result, this will lead to the different incentives in China, which will be the main of our case. So, first of all, why would it mainly be China? Because as we agree with the mechanism of opening government, that this will not be about just minor sanctions and whatever. This will be about severe economical damage being done to a country. There are a very limited amount of actors that can actually do this. One of them is obviously the US, but I think the US is not necessarily that relevant in this debate because no one is likely to actually declare war on the US given their relative military power. Sure.
Do you think that China, USA, or Russia do not apply this principle already, regardless that the international community doesn't recognize a law in which they can do it?
Partner will respond to that. I didn't really get it. Either way. So why is it does not like to be the US? Is it likely to be China? Why? They have massive economic capabilities that's been building up over the past years, and therefore they're likely to essentially be able to use these tools against other countries to keep them under control. Those countries can, for example, then ask for help from the US, and therefore, from that point essentially a conflict can arise. Why is China this economic power? Usually, they are part of lots of production processes that are necessary for a country to essentially have that, and as a result, if they can cut them off of these kind of things, it does massive damage. They have a large internal market that's usually the basis of lots of economies around it, selling these goods in China. They usually have large investments in these countries. Suddenly pulling them away will do massive economic damage. They have territorial waters that are necessary for lots of actors in the region. China has this capability and is building up this capability in order to get power in the region. Why is China likely to essentially press down and get this kind of regional hegemony? Well, it's kind of likely to go for it, even if there are risks of, for example, war occurring. Well, it's simply because this is in the vital interest of China right now. Why? They have a slowing economy that is just going slower and slower every single year. Why is this a threat to them? Well, because it means the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, which is based on fundamentally on economic growth, is under threat. It means everyone in government has a reason to essentially make sure that this doesn't get any worse, and also they're in a more risky position against other actors if it's apparent that they're weaker and getting weaker over time. So why do they need to control over their region? One, China has a lack of natural resources that it currently imports from these other countries. If these other countries move away, this is a massive threat to their economic growth. Second of all, they have usually a lack of labor and a lack of basic simple labor and a lack of basic goods like agricultural goods. So therefore, it's significantly more likely that once they're significantly likely that they use these tools essentially to prevent extra independence of, for example, South Asian countries, or prevent more collaboration with the West or collaboration with Japan. It's regional. How do you call it? Competitors.
POI?
No, thank you. Already PY. So this essentially what this matters is that currently there's a lot of investment from China in economic means to essentially control the relevant regions around the world, but most importantly in the relevant region. So currently the benefit of economic sanctions and economic capability and building it up is essentially the fact that there will not be military reprisals. No other actor is likely to step in properly with actual means that can harm China in the long run. Therefore, it's very beneficial to invest in these things, and therefore it gains them power without losing these kind of things. So military retaliations currently will not happen simply because the main countries cannot fight, and the US needs some sort of legitimacy in order to declare a war, because it has to sell it to its population. Even cases like Iraq, they even needed to bring up a reason like having these weapons of mass destruction. It's likely a reason is needed, and if anything of an opening government has to stand, it has to be seen as an acceptable thing to declare a war for this reason, and usually if it's acceptable for one country to declare a war for this reason, it's acceptable to help this country for this war for this reason, essentially. No, thank you. So essentially, once you make this more legitimate to international law, there's now also a deterrent against economical means being applied to use pressure, either the threat of them or the actual use of them. So why is this now a thing? At this moment, you have a relative disincentive to use economic measures. Other measures are on the table for political power in the region, which are mainly military measures, are now increased, and therefore you invest in their capability because they're more relevant to you compared to economic measures in the past. So what does actually essentially look like? But first, I will take a PY from closing. Yeah, close.
Countries have military skirmishes, short of war, all the time. See India, Pakistan, see Estonia, Russia, etc. This is a thing that happens.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's worse if it increases, because currently China is investing mainly into getting economic power and protecting economic power in the region. At the moment, it sees this as less fruitful and less likely to actually essentially work. They're more likely to essentially go to military means because they have now a relative advantage, and mainly building up their capability to do these kind of things. So what are these kind of things that we can talk about? Usually this is us as doing threats of military effects, and sometimes doing them, for example, just to a single country to show that you actually can do these kind of things. So what kind of things can China do? Use for example, Chinese minorities, like in the same way that essentially Russia does it, to stir up controversy, to stir up conflict in order to destabilize the region and potentially have a reason to intervene, to buy more weapons, to have more relative strength, to therefore make all threats significantly more scary, to use to build up a larger navy that's actually likely to contest points of other countries and more likely to invade and do massive economic damage by a military mean, which is therefore a military mean. So why are these military means so significantly worse? One, all military actions in themselves have significantly higher chances that lead to escalation. The mere build-up of military power can be seen as a threat in the region that would lead to an escalation that can eventually lead to war, and war has a massive impact in this debate. Second of all, economic damages can usually be replaced, for example, example, by a sanction of one country can be lifted, for example, by another country stepping in and giving aid. If essentially China builds up weapons, it's not very much, or for example, builds up a larger fleet, it's significantly harder to essentially make sure that this doesn't lead into a bad situation. So for all these reasons, even though it sounds very nice that we decrease the amount of economic warfare, if it comes at any cost of build-up of military power in a region that's already very volatile, we are very proud to oppose.
Thank that speaker very much and welcome the GPM.
Oops. Good. I'm going to first deal with OO and then ask two simple questions. First, is this justified regardless of the utilitarian consequences and hence enough to win this debate? And secondly, what will lead to better outcomes? First, let's deal with OO. OO says basically in a very big argument that big countries will use this to bully the little countries that may attack them as a consequence of this policy. Two main rebutals. First, big countries as China, the US or USA already do this, and this policy it's impactless to them. The USA entered Iraq and Afghanistan, China, Southeast Asia and Tibet, Russia, Crimea and Georgia. As I stated in my POI, the fact that you put this law doesn't change a single incentive in the international community for those big actors who can already act regardless of the international law. Second rebuttal is the argument is premised in a wrong premise, which is the small countries have any ability whatsoever to cause harm to these big countries. The resources of these big countries, like China, like US, like Russia, are so big that these little countries like Vietnam, like Thailand, like one of the quotes, lack the tools to cause any harm. They have GDPs who are like 1 to 100 compared to those big countries, and they have inability to cause harm. Hence, this argument they make falls out of the debate because it wouldn't be this like the fact that we're presuming, which would be that they have caused a massive harm to the country. Given that these countries cannot cause a massive harm, this argument falls out of the debate because this wouldn't be proportionate to the response they are making. They would have never made this harm to the country, which would justify this. The framing that Javi told you in this debate, that this only changed the life of the countries who didn't act before because of the reason that they need the international community, hence they don't attack in the status quo. We think that these are the only countries that get affected by this motion because before they didn't attack, they didn't retaliate by the fact that they knew that the international community wouldn't be with them and they need the international community. Two questions in this speech. First, is it justified to do this regardless of the consequence? Look, Javi told you several things. That there's economic situation is harmed, that the resources of the country are damaged a lot, but not the iteration of this argument and how it flows to the future. This means that it is not only a harm for these present years when the economic starvation happens. It also means that it's perpetuated for years because you harm the ability of the country to perpetuate and to go further in time. Let's give me a precise example. If in Jordan it was cut out the shortage of water and the crops fucked up during like as consequence of this shortage of water, probably those crops do not grow up in 1 year. You need many years in order to grow up the infrastructures and the things that have been harmed as an iteration of the problem that was caused due to stagnation. This iteration of the problem caused that it is proportionate. Two more reasons why it's proportionate. First, because there's likelihood that the attacks that you make are small attacks and proportionate. Not only because the law says so, but also because you don't want to get massive retaliation too. So you probably won't attack civilians. You probably attack things that you know that can cause harm, but probably with the intention to cause the harm, not massive retaliation. Why this argument and this principle is enough to win the debate regardless of the practical consequences. Let me bump you a moral intuition. When legitimate defense rules in any country in the world, someone goes into your house, it's about to attack you and to kill you, you don't ask that person whether he killed or didn't kill the person that entered the home. This principle is not adjudicated with utilitarian calculus. Rather, if it is justified to attack that person that went into your house due to the consequence that the most important thing to you is being under threat. The reason why this is the case, and there's not a way utilitarianly to adjudicate this, is that we recognize that there is a real and imminent threat to you, the most important thing to you, your life. And
And hence, we recognize that regardless of the consequence, as long as you are proportionally, you are acting in legitimate defense. We think that the extension of this principle makes this obligation to recognize in the international community, regardless of there's harms, you have the right to respond to an immediate threat that not only harms your population in this moment, but also in the future. We win this debate regardless of the outcomes if they don't refute that you have the right to defend yourself when an imminent threat is being caused. Secondly, does this lead to good outcome or does it not? First, we told you in Harry's speech that this leads to better outcome because the principle of mutually assured destruction that is in international countries with nuclear weapons can also be extended in the small scales for these countries that we're talking about. We tell you when there's this escalation of violence, it is more likely that they don't do things that could lead to worse outcomes. The dependence of the international community is essential to understanding this point. Previously, Jordan could not retaliate to the other countries that are surrounded because they knew that in problems, they need the international community to support them. Hence, in status quo, they cannot do it. The change in the delta we give from status quo is that we allow them to do it as long as proportional, as long as they retaliate based on the harm that they are being caused. But note, why do we think that even a few months of military combat leads to less harms than years of economic suffering? Most of the reasons here. First, it is most likely that civilian harms are marginal in these wars that we're talking about. First, because it's against their own interests due to retaliation that could happen. Probably we'll be seeing things like attacking the rebels on the infrastructures of this country. We'll be seeing things like attacking the most essential thing for the economy because they are in their interest not to get massive retaliation against civilians. Secondly, it is also likely because they still need the reputation of the international community. Even if it's permitted in international law, if they go hard, if they go massive, probably they lose those international supports that were essential to them to develop, to maintain their infrastructures that have been harmed. Hence, it is likely that we have less on marginal civilian attacks. Secondly, the international community in these type of events will intervene quickly. First, due to the incentives they have to stop the conflict, because of the alliance, and because of the desire to stop violence. What we think this conflict will be short, but will solve conflict thanks to the international community. Yes.
Probably I would assume that when you sign international law, each country follows it exactly to the letter. This is not how international law, what countries do.
This is wrong way to adjudicate this debate. You recognize in the law the principle of legitimate defense, even if someone then takes the legitimate defense in a wrong way. If they do it in a wrong way, you punish them. If someone enters to your house and when he's leaving, you kill him when there was not immediate threat, you punish that people. We are not telling you to justify anything that is not principle. We tell to you that if it's justified and proportional, it must be done. If you are disproportionate, then you should be combated as in any other law in the world. Finally, why do we think that the few months are less than the economic suffering? What we tell to you is that the economic suffering perpetuates the damage forever. It stops the development of infrastructures. It lacks the materials. The economic capital to invent is also lacked for many years. Basic foods and drug supply get stagnated for the country. Even if you cause some civilian harms, which are undesirable, the comparative in this debate is the years and years and years of stagnation that you submit a country without a legitimate tool to stop that thing to happen. We think this is morally justified, but most importantly, we also think that in the future, this leads to better outcomes. We think people will be safe. We're very proud to oppose and win this debate. Thanks.
And I welcome the GLO.
Okay. In opening opposition, we think this debate is strictly about how the incentives of actors change at the point where you change international law. Note the massive problem that exists already in opening government to start with is that they assume that when something is recognized by international law, that all actors under international law, or at least a significant amount of people, will positively act in order to defend it. Note the fact that the international community is unlikely to to do so if it is not meaningfully in their interest. I think a large part of the idea that happens in opening government, that small countries will now be able to defend themselves against the economic abuse from bigger countries, is entirely reliant on the fact that the international community will step in and actually militarily defend those countries, risking their own soldiers in order to do so. I think specifically that is relatively unlikely, even if that potential legitimacy of the response is recognized by international law, because it does not force those countries to act in ways that are otherwise structurally negative for their own interests. What we tell you, therefore, crucially in opening opposition is that the relevant way in which this actually changes is the specific things that you can put into alliances. We think those are potentially things where actual commitment by other countries happens in order to defend each other. We think that specifically is something which, however, is crucially negative because we think it decreases the value of economic warfare, which means that those actors which would otherwise have pursued their vital interests through economic warfare now do so differently. The current value of that economic warfare is that there is limited resistance, because I think, as opening government correctly states, there are small victim states, and the sanctions that are currently placed in response to economic warfare are typically survivable, especially for the states that we're talking about here, which have significant amount of ability to sustain economic damage because they are relatively economically secure, because they have large amounts of states that are economically dependent on them, which means they can largely balance this out. Crucially then, what happens at the point where you change their incentives, because they have vital interests that they are currently defending through economic warfare, is that they move through other ways of extracting those things from the states that they were previously pressuring economically. We think those things are things like destabilizing those countries' governments and threatening them militarily. We think that means building up your military capacity in their proximity. We think it means making sure that their governments are simply bought out and work with you. We think specifically those things are worse for those countries for a couple of reasons. One, because they are less substitutable than economic damages sustained in economic warfare, because you can't simply align yourself with a different economic bloc on the globe led by a geopolitical competitor of the country that is pressuring you, and then have them help you out in order to sustain things. We think that specific at the point where you're militarily threatened, a big part of the damage is, one, already done, but two, it is significantly more risky for the United States to militarily defend someone against China than to give them a bit of money to sustain the damages that they are currently suffering as a result of China pressuring them. We think, therefore, it is crucially less likely that those countries will be newly defended, that they claim on opening government, which I think is their main consequential benefit. I think, however, crucially, additionally, they will be subject to worse, those countries that would be relevantly defended will therefore be subject to worse measures in terms of how China then chooses to pressure them. We think that is specifically due to the fact that essentially you change the relative calculus between military and economic warfare. At the point where economic warfare is currently in your interest, that is because of limited resistance. However, at the point where the resistance is one that is military, there are two crucial things that change. One, it means that you simply just don't have that limited resistance component anymore. Two, it is easier to defend yourself against military resistance at the point where you also have a military presence in a place already, where you also have a destabilized government there already. But that means that you crucially have the incentive to pursue that interest in that specific manner, because it means that you are more secure against it, and because it is now in your relative calculus more in your interest. Specific response and then a trade-off to opening government. First, I think that their material regarding the idea that economic warfare is particularly damaging. I agree with the fact that economic warfare does huge amount of damages, but specifically because of the reasons that I've explained to you in terms of why it is more likely that you can sustain it or essentially evade and substitute it by other means, I think it is probably better for the citizens of your country to be subject to economic pressure than it is to military conflict at military risk. We think specifically that is true because military risk, note, also is not something that is just a 5-month conflict and then it's over. One, in war, specifically in wars started over massive economic abuse, economic resources are also substantially destroyed. You want to destroy supply lines. You want to destroy capacity to attack you back. That all means that economic resources will be destroyed. Two, economic retaliation. If you are trying to retaliate against China militarily, that also means they can presumably do the same thing to you because, note, they don't need international law legitimacy to do this. We think specifically that also means that your economic means are very relevantly destroyed. I don't necessarily see how you're better off on that side. But lastly, we think that broadly, even if conflict never occurs, which we think is probably the case in the vast majority of these cases, like military tension is something that escalates itself up. At the point where one state is building up, you need to build up as well, which means that resources are diverted into this, that you focus your country, your government, your economy on being sustainable for military conflict at the point where initial build-up has begun. We think that is also immensely destructive to those countries' ability to develop and function properly.
Point?
Yeah.
Economic warfare is going to be only done in the cases where that economic harm is actually not replaceable. That is why it's effective in the first place. Clearly, like, this is completely equivalent to military damage in terms of being irreplaceable in the cases that are relevant in this debate.
It is not entirely irreplaceable, it is damaging. I think it is presumably fair to say that yes, indeed, you sustain some damage from being the subject of economic warfare. I think the entire irreplaceability and the entire inevitability of it is probably is uncertain. Like, look, you don't have to inflict absolute damage upon a country. You can also simply raise the costs of them doing something that you don't like. That is something where they then have to align themselves with a different bloc for which they presumably have to give concessions. That is a negotiating thing which countries tend to do, which seems just relatively reasonable. Additional response to opening government. One, I think in terms of the principle that they offer us, I don't think that a principle that tends to make wars more dirty and more damaging for all the people involved is presumably a good one. Like, even if at the meta level of states choosing to go to war, they are correct, I don't think the soldiers dying on the ground agree with you, because specifically they are not placed in that position by actors that they chose very frequently, and secondly, you are just ultimately in a position where this leads to an idea of vigilantism rather than actually meaningfully addressing the problem. I think the principle probably stands to some extent. I don't think it wins the debate. Secondly, however, I think with regard to the idea that big countries already apply this, and this is solely something good for smaller countries. Like, look. One, we think that specifically what this does is this massively increases the amount of countries for which the risk of military conflict now accrues as a result of economic warfare. We think that is specifically more damaging through the mechanism of alliances we have shown you. That is specifically why you have additional risk of conflict and why countries are subject to worse measures of pressure. Therefore, you vote OA.
Very much and welcome the member of government.
Remember the video?
Yeah. Okay, now streaming, please.
Can I start? Okay. 2 points in my speech. First, how we think that countries will misuse this policy to forward their personal agendas because we think that international law is something that can do that. And secondly, what happens when small countries attack large, why specifically we think that there's going to be retaliation after such an attack and why this is something that can snowball and is obviously a bad thing. First, a few points of rebuttal. Look, notice that what we're getting is that notice that there's a bit of a tension between opening government and closing government, because opening government talk about like huge things, like 200,000 people dying, and like really big things, and that is going to be that gives you the ability to actually use this law. Then closing government say no, but it's really sometimes it's small things like it's a strait or it's like a certain dam or something like that. We say that first of all this is tension. Secondly, we say that it's in their case we think it's just ridiculous to allow military intervention, specifically when it's such a small interference as it is. But then we say that we think that, and that there's much more likely chance that if it's something so small, then there's a good chance that you can actually negotiate and do talking and things like that between countries. But lastly, we say, the question really is whether countries will continue to retaliate even after such an attack, even if it's a small attack. What does that small attack mean to the country that's being attacked? And that's specifically what we're going to give you. Then they say that the large countries that are hurting small countries. So again, we're just not sure how much military retaliation is going to specifically work. Like if a big country is being they have anti-missile like things. They have ways to protect their citizens. We think that just trying to attack them causes more anger and more harm and is not going to even get the results that they want, but will get the bad things that we're going to explain on our side of the house. Then, okay, that's my rebuttal. So to my first point, look, we need a bit of framing for this debate because this is something really interesting that happens. The question in this debate is not whether it's justified to attack under such circumstances. It's whether international law should recognize it as being justified to attack. And that's where opening government have a big problem in their case. Because international law has consequences, we say. And we also think that another framing to this debate, which is really important, is that we don't think that the status quo, many countries can actually economically squeeze out and kill another country. Like the whole framing to this debate that they give is so old and not relevant anymore. And the examples that we have are given in the specifically in the sort of info slide, show that it's not really possible to do such drastic things. So the question is, how is this law really likely to be put into effect? How specifically are countries going to use this? And that's the real interesting question in this debate. Because look, how do we think that countries are going to actually use this? Because we say, what does substantial economic harm mean? I don't know. And it's very vague. Okay, it's similar, we'll give you just kind of an example, to the phrase that the WTO uses that allows a country to use protectionist policies to protect national security. For example, when Trump used this ambiguity to say that he could put a tariff on steel because that was in his national security and that was really important. And nobody could do anything about it because under this ambiguity, it's perfectly fine to do such a thing. However, this new ambiguity that they give is much more harmful than steel tariffs. Why? Because we say that countries will use this ambiguity to their political advantage. So let me just give you a few examples that are so intuitive. Look, the US can now justify attacking in the South China Sea. Why? Because what we think that China is now doing to the United States, the trade war, that Trump is sure that China is responsible for it, is substantial economic harm. Another example, the US could use this to attack Iran because the Strait of Hormuz. And do they have things to attack in Iran? Of course they do. They would love to have any sort of thing that would let them be legitimate in attacking places in Iran. Thirdly, we think that Russia could justify Crimea, for example, because they needed the strait. They needed the canal there that was extremely economically important for them, and Crimea didn't let them use it. They say, oh, but they do it anyway. Maybe. However, this has huge consequences now when the international community cannot put sanctions on these countries, cannot actually retaliate on them, cannot say that their actions aren't justifiable, right? Because we say that in this case, you can't sanction Russia. You can't say that the United States didn't do something wrong. And ambiguity is really important in big organizations such as the UN or NATO and things like that. Because when ambiguity comes about in a lot of these things, then they would rather take the easy way and say, well, it's ambiguous and we're not exactly sure, so you know what, we're not going to make any sanctions, we're not going to do anything, we're not going to say that what you did is wrong because we're not exactly sure, no thank you, and we'd rather just step back. These are important structures that put balance in the world when there's something that is done wrong. Sanctions do work. Sanctions on Russia have done economic harm. If we can't put them, that is problematic, okay? We say that this is a huge harm that happens in our world, which they have not addressed at all, and we think that this is a really important thing. I'll take a POI from first.
So she concedes that this has no delta on big countries doing this, it's just you cannot sanction them. This case is entirely problematic by the fact that Crimea wouldn't be justified on the principle because it's not the suppose in which you were really harmed by Crimea.
But we think that they can't. I've given you real analysis on why anyone can justify real economic harm, and I think that economic sanctions are very effective and are much better than other options that we have. Secondly, why do we think that countries are very likely to retaliate after an attack? Because an attack is not like an economic attack. When you have a missile flying into an area that has that, and we don't agree that it's always going to be proportional. Like it could be an area with citizens in it. We think that it makes a lot of people afraid, security-wise, right? Because of another attack. It gets media attention. It's viewed in a very problematic way by the population, which then pressures government to retaliate as well in order to seem strong. And also, again, showing strength. The fact that I can retaliate against something that somebody has done to me is really important in these cases. Notice that, that we're not talking about a full-on war, which is really important, but this retaliation back and forth is extremely problematic. We don't understand why it's not problematic. Citizens are can get killed in this back and forth. This is large harm. And we say something really interesting. Notice that it's legitimate to retaliate against military retaliation, right? Under international laws. So once you've actually gone into that weird loop where somebody has attacked you military-wise, it is legitimate for you to attack them back military-wise, because that's what international law says that you're allowed to do. And we say that this, and again, notice that if it's a big country against a small country, boy do we fuck over the small country, okay? Because the big country has way more weapons, they have way more drones, they have way more ways to do attacks, and we say that that's just horribly. We think that the metric for judging this debate is on the practicality of what happens at the end of the day. Not the justification of it, but what the specific international law entails, what it will actually cause, and for these reasons, we think we've given you the biggest impacts, and we're very proud to oppose.
Thank that speaker very much and welcome to Gov Whip.
I've always wanted to experience that. Can I borrow some of your table? Is that okay?
You can.
Ready? The reason there's no tension between our case and OG's is that the dam that blocks all of Egypt's freshwater supply is not a small thing. It's a small structure in that for Egypt it is relatively easy to sabotage that one Ethiopian dam. All you need is one bomb. Most people can construct that if you will, right? But the damage it causes is huge, basically at the point where you have no ability to resist that. You have no ability to react, which opposition has conceded when opposition argued that there is currently limited resistance by these targeted countries when you have economic warfare. That is why Jon has won this debate. A few points of response to CEO, then talking about why the military retaliation is on our side and why this prevents
some bullying at least, which is better than preventing no bullying, and why we want. Firstly, they say this justifies the Crimean Strait being taken by Russia. Why this isn't true? Because if you take money from me, I can argue that you have caused me substantial economic harm. If you withhold access from me to your personal bank account, which would benefit me, yeah, sure, that is not something that you can tell is economic damage to me. Harms are contextual to what you have previously had by detracting from what you had before. So this access to, for example, the Crimean Strait is something that adds to Russia's economic prosperity, but it's not something that can be used as a precedent here. Secondly, they say it's hard to have sanctions on Russia. Why is this untrue? It's because we think when the C18 wrote deliberate economic policies that substantially cause economic harm, presumably this meant in the context of doing this not in response to something else, or for example, not as legitimate international responses due to international law being broken by Russia, but as specific things to cause harm on that instead of, for example, pressure them away from Crimea, which is something that you can use as a justification for those, because the point of that is not cause Russia economic harm, it is to punish Russia for infringing on sovereignty of others. So we don't think this actually, if anything, means that you can justify more of this against these aggressive states at this point, especially if they militarily retaliate, like opposition has constantly claimed. To retaliation, note that all material on retaliation by opposition is contingent on these infringements still occurring in the first place, which is something that Johan has told to you why they do not occur in the first place. As China, it now costs me more than it gains me to take things in the South China Sea. Ethiopia, it now costs me more to build that dam than not build it. This is why retaliation probably doesn't occur, because there's no reason why these aggressions still occur in the first place. But furthermore, why even if they why they don't retaliate and or why they do, that doesn't really matter. So they when they say, that China, for example, Ogo's case is saying China can respond militarily, to some degree might be true, but not the burden of opposition on this debate isn't just to prove that they can do so, but they will do so, and that is something that they have never actually done, right? Because there's no explanation to why in every case these trade wars and these conflicts are so vital that you will have no option but to do this, right? Johan has explained to you why often these small marginal economic gains, getting a bit more ability to pressure your neighbors politically, because they're no politically less independent, because every conversation within that country now takes place in the context of, does this anger China or not? Does this anger Russia or not? This is something that they have never responded to. Furthermore, secondly, we think international goodwill counts for something, right? If you must engage in direct military skirmishes as China, the military conflict looks worse for you. If fresh water, in Vietnam, is slightly more expensive, the US, etc., are not really pressured to respond in the same way that you will be pressured to at least respond, at least in terms of political condemnation, which is still better than nothing, at the point where you kill Vietnamese people or sink Vietnamese ships. Note that economic warfare is currently occurring and being conducted by these countries because of limited resistance as per OO analysis. When you have resistance, and often effective resistance that specifically undoes the damage that is imposed on these countries by the economic warfare itself, that is when uniquely it no longer makes sense to conduct this economic warfare. And note, at best, O's case means that where this is vital, this will still occur. Yes, Israel might still take Golan Heights, because that's where most of your fresh water comes from. But note that the burden on their side is at least, and then on our side, that means we're not preventing all bullying, but we're only preventing most bullying, which is still comparatively better than what they are achieving. Note that most economic bullying by countries is not vital. The US economy will not fall because they don't have a trade war with China. China's economy will not fall because Mongolia decides to do a trade deal with another country instead. It's incredibly hard for them to justify retaliations, right? But at least in the cases where this is about marginal economic gains, which in the most cases it is, because there's literally no consequence to you doing this, right? You can only gain by being aggressive in these cases. That is why you you do them. CO, yeah.
So notice that being militarily attacked is extremely scary for citizens and put large pressure on the government to show strength and to retaliate back, especially when they don't have much to lose by replying back.
So the thing is, like, firstly, you have never explained why you will still have economic warfare. Secondly, what you need to note is because it is scary, and because, for example, there are soldiers who have families, who like go to the media, who when they die, people care about, you have body bag syndrome, which means there is incentives for you not to have even small, like, military damages as China. Also note, for example, that it's hard for you to argue that these cannot be significant, because all of themselves say, in the South China Sea, you're now more likely to have US military involved, in case of which, if you claim this doesn't happen, COU are knighting them. But also note, like, these more skirmishes is actually good, because it causes disincentives, like, even if like OG would be wrong about the fact that this would not affect small, like large countries. That those cause disincentive to cause economic harm in the first place, because currently you do it for small gains, and you can split units. Why do we win over OG? OG proves that it's justified as an act of self-defense in terms of being proportionate. They never prove that it is effective, and thus also, if you believe their principal claims and believe them to be the most important in this debate, Jonas has uniquely unlocked that at two levels. One, he has explained why these are specifically effective often in addressing the specific economic harm that has been caused to you. You now get fresh water because that dam has to be blown up. You now get access to international seas because you have access that's trade again. Secondly, he's explained why this changes the incentives for the economic warfare to happen in the first place. That means that small, tiny countries can offset the majority of bullying. Currently, the reason you cannot do that is because tiny countries are targeted by international law. See, all sanctions by the UN being placed on poor and small countries, etc. So at the point where you would currently respond, you would be sanctioned. And we simply, by preventing that disincentive that currently exists, we have won this debate. Propose.
That speaker very much. Let's close the debate. Welcome you after 3 minutes.
Okay. OG want a clean mechanism and a clean law. A law that every country will abide by the letter, and conflicts that will be just as short as they need to be under their metric. The OG do not live under the real world. This is not how the real world functions. This is not how countries function. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to look about the two types of conflicts that were generally had. That is asymmetric conflicts, i.e. large countries versus small countries, and then same strength countries, and how does it happen. And look how both types of war actually look like. Let's start with the first type, about the large countries versus small countries, because there are two sides to look at. A is the abuse of the large countries, of the small countries, B, the ability of small countries to retaliate. Let's look at the abuse. We say a very simple thing. You are now enshrining this kind of law that allows in certain situations countries to militarily respond to this kind of stuff. We say, specifically in our extension, that this is ambiguous. This is very likely to be used massively by stronger countries. Not specifically how the dynamics within the United Nations and bodies like that work. Countries have blocs, countries have allies. Russia is allied with China, etc. It is very, very hard under the status quo to actually sanction and prevent countries from actually going to war. It is super hard to pass these kinds of sanctions. Now you check them, the absolute good narrative of this is now legitimate because of our self-interest or self-economic specific interest. We say a very simple thing. Because it's so vague and because countries have the ability to persuade, apply pressure on other countries, use this kind of criteria to their advantage, convince other countries that this is a massive harm. Even if objectively this is not such a massive harm to this country, this is something they use. My partner gave you the example of how Donald Trump completely misused the criteria of national interest in order to do whatever the hell it wants. When a country has that power, it can do that. Comparatively, when there is no law that legitimizes by any stretch of the mile military retaliation for this kind of economic stuff, it's so much harder for these countries to do. How does this look like? This looks like countries attacking smaller countries that are just blocking them in trade. This looks like the US abusing this kind of power to do whatever the hell it wants with in Iran or any other example there. And this is why the responses from CG actually miss our case. It's not that it is impossible under our law to do sanctions, not that our law prevents sanctions in the cases. It's that practically these sanctions are so much harder to pass because you don't have because now they have the political capital to go against these sanctions and abuse this kind of law. That means that you get much more abuse de facto of countries, much more wars, much more conflicts, much more attacks on other smaller countries. Now let's talk about the flip side of that. No, thank you. Of smaller countries actually having the ability to resist. The case that we heard from CG. This is going to be a bit complex, so let's track it one by one. They say that smaller countries have the ability to launch a military attack that might cost quite a bit to the bigger country. Note specifically that the smaller country in this kind of military conflict is very likely to get absolutely demolished by, let's say, the Chinese army. This is then, the cost for these smaller countries is so much larger than the larger countries. China knows that. China knows that it can then abuse that, go into this kind of conflict and not expect a response because the other side is so much more afraid than China is. Even if there is a cost to China, it is asymmetric. Therefore, the threat of warfare is not a large threat in this debate. China can still do all this kind of abuses and CG achieve nothing by their kind of mechanism. This entire extension then fall out of this debate because this is an ineffective tool for smaller countries to do that. So to conclude this kind of conflict, we get this kind of conflict in which larger countries have more of an ability to excuse themselves in the eyes of the international community to do whatever the hell they want. Smaller countries have no actual ability to respond to that. Yes, opening.
Russia already justified their action under international law principles. Example, responsibility to protect the Russian population in Crimea. At best, what happened is that now they will use a different principle to misinterpret it and justify their action.
Yes, thank you. Yes. Crimea was a specific example in which you had a Russian minority specifically within a certain area. This is one specific example. You don't have a principle to justify every occasion. There is a large set of occasions in which specifically the economics of this scenario is the only justification that can go with. Country blocking trade to you. Like, let's say, the example in which this motion is probably predicated on the blocking of the Hormuz Straits via Iran and the US, which is a very likely scenario to actually happen within the debate, which you cannot justify with anything else in the debate. But let's then talk about like more equal conflict, because opening I will say, but this is a nice deterrent. You are going to do this once, then the conflict is going to disappear and everyone will just be happy because you solved the problem. No. Again, we will point the reality in this case. We say that specifically when you attack a country militarily, it is very different from economics. We accept from what the government say that it might have the same harm, not the same perception, not the same in the way that countries react. Because note, you actually see the planes flying above your head, bombing the road near to you. You have the media talking about this attack that has happened. You have your president, your national security talking about this attack. You have people scared in the street. No, thank you. You have specifically, let's say, in this kind of symmetric conflict that probably talking about Pakistan, India. You have tensions between these countries that exist altogether. I think that the perception of the public there is a perception of our national identity, our national security, our safety is then harmed. They actually came and bomb our country. Therefore, response is so much more likely, specifically in these kind of cases. The other response that is happening, an escalation of this kind of conflict. How is specifically beat OG? Because OG based the entire case on proportionality. They want the response to be exactly proportional to the harm. When you have this escalation, another attack, the overall harm is unproportional to the original harm that has happened, therefore taking him on their own metric. Lastly, how we compare with the opening opposition. The opening opposition told you why conflicts are likely to be a bit more militarized and weapons are somewhat likely to be used. We actually explained the process of militarization, why retaliation is actually happening, something the O is predicated on. B, we actually explained to you why conflicts are so much more likely to happen because of the mechanisms of the abuse of the international law. We say that this is an actual mechanism that creates more conflict within the world. Panel, you should not ask yourself whether or not it is a just thing. You should ask yourself whether or not this is a law that should be passed under international law. The practical results of that are just overall negative. We beg to oppose.
Thanks everyone. If you want to leave the room and shake hands, good luck for